Few buildings in history carried as much meaning for a nation as the Temple of Solomon. For the people of Israel, this was not simply a religious building or a national monument. It represented something far greater. It was meant to become the place where the name of the Lord would dwell among his people. For many years before the temple existed, Israel worshipped God in a different way. At the center of their faith was the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that contained the tablets of the law given to Moses. This ark symbolized the covenant between God and Israel and represented his presence among them. But the ark did not rest inside a permanent structure. Instead, it was kept inside the tabernacle, a sacred tent built during the days of Moses, while the Israelites were traveling through the wilderness. Even after Israel settled in the Promised Land, this tent continued to serve as the main place of worship. Then something changed during the reign of King David. According to 2 Samuel chapter 7, David looked at his own palace, built with cedar and beauty, and felt troubled by one thought. He lived in a magnificent house, yet the Ark of God remained inside a tent. David desired to build a temple for the Lord, a permanent house worthy of the God of Israel. However, God revealed that David would not be the one to build it. Through the prophet Nathan, the Lord declared that the temple would be built by David's son. That son would be Solomon. When Solomon became king, he inherited not only the throne of Israel, but also the responsibility of fulfilling this promise. Jerusalem had already been established as the political and spiritual center of the nation. Now Solomon would begin a project that would shape the history of Israel for generations. But this raises several fascinating questions. How did an ancient kingdom organize a construction project of this scale? Where did the enormous stones, the cedar wood from Lebanon, and the vast amounts of gold come from? Who were the thousands of workers involved in the construction? And why does the Bible say that while the temple was being built, no hammer or iron tool was heard in Jerusalem? Today, we will explore one of the most remarkable construction projects described in the Bible. Stone by stone, decision by decision. We will uncover the secrets behind the construction of Solomon's temple, the house built for the name of the Lord. Before we continue, take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy discovering the deeper stories of the Bible, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. And I'd also love to know where you're watching from today. Write your city and country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far the message of the Bible is reaching. Long before the first stone of the temple was ever cut, before the cedars of Lebanon were transported to Jerusalem, before thousands of workers began preparing the materials, the idea of the temple began as something much simpler. It began as a desire in the heart of a king. King David had established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The city had become both the political center of the kingdom and the spiritual center of the nation, and especially after David brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city. The Ark, which symbolized the presence of God among his people, had finally found a resting place in Jerusalem. But there was still something unusual about the situation. David lived in a royal palace built with fine cedar wood, a sign of stability, wealth, and royal authority. Yet the Ark of God, the most sacred object in Israel, was kept inside a tent, the tabernacle that had existed since the days of Moses. One day, David spoke about this with the prophet Nathan. The account in 2 Samuel chapter 7 tells us that David said something that reveals his heart. He was living in a house of cedar, while the Ark of God remained in a tent. To David, this did not seem right. If the king of Israel lived in a permanent and beautiful palace, should not the Lord also have a permanent house? David wanted to build a temple. At first, the prophet Nathan encouraged him. The idea seemed noble and honorable. Building a temple for the Lord appeared to be a natural next step for the kingdom of Israel. But that same night, something unexpected happened. God spoke to Nathan and gave him a message for David. The Lord made it clear that David would not be the one to build the temple. Instead, God reminded David of something important. Throughout Israel's history, since the time of the Exodus from Egypt, God had never asked for a permanent house made of stone and cedar. He had been with his people while they moved from place to place. Then the message took an even deeper turn. Instead of David building a house for God, God declared that he would establish a house for David. In biblical language, this referred not to a physical building but to a dynasty, a royal line that would continue through David's descendants. God promised that one of David's sons would reign after him, and that this son would be the one who would build the temple. This promise became one of the most important moments in Israel's history. It meant that the temple would be connected directly to the family line of David. The future king would not only rule the nation, but would also be responsible for building the central place of worship for the God of Israel. Years passed, and David continued to reign over Israel. Although he would never build the temple himself, the biblical record shows that he began preparing for it long before his death. That David gathered materials for the future construction. He collected gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, and timber. He also organized the Levites and priests who would later serve in the temple. Even though the structure itself would not be built during his lifetime, David ensured that the foundation for the project was ready. This preparation reveals something important about David's vision. The temple was never meant to be a small or ordinary structure. From the very beginning, it was planned to be a place that reflected honor, beauty, and reverence for the Lord. When David's life was coming to an end, the responsibility for the temple passed to his son Solomon. Solomon was still young when he became king, but he inherited a kingdom that was stable and prosperous. Israel had experienced military victories under David, and the surrounding regions were largely at peace. This created the perfect conditions for a massive construction project. But Solomon also inherited something more important than political stability. He inherited the promise. The temple was not simply Solomon's idea. It was not just a royal building project designed to display wealth or power. According to the biblical narrative, it was the fulfillment of the word God had spoken years earlier. Solomon understood this responsibility. In the book of 1 Kings, we see Solomon beginning to organize the work needed to make the temple a reality. He knew that building the house of the Lord would require planning on a scale Israel had never attempted before. Massive quantities of materials would be needed. Skilled craftsmen would be required. Workers would have to cut stones, transport timber, and prepare every piece of the structure before it could even arrive in Jerusalem. The temple would become the largest and most complex construction project in Israel's history. Yet the origin of the entire project remained deeply personal. It started with a king who wanted to honor God. David never saw the completed temple with his own eyes, but his desire, his preparations, and the promise given to him became the foundation for everything that followed. What began as a thought in David's heart would eventually become one of the most famous buildings described in the Bible. And the next step in this remarkable story begins far from Jerusalem, in distant forests, quarries, and foreign kingdoms. Because before the temple could rise on Mount Moriah, Solomon needed something essential, the materials that would make the construction possible. Before the Temple of Solomon could rise above Jerusalem, before the golden walls and sacred chambers could take shape, an enormous challenge had to be solved first: the materials. The Bible makes it clear that the temple was not built with ordinary resources. The structure required rare wood, massive stones, precious metals, and highly skilled craftsmanship. Gathering these materials would demand international alliances, large-scale organization, and careful planning long before the actual construction began. One of the most important materials mentioned in the biblical account was cedar wood. Cedar from Lebanon was famous throughout the ancient world. These trees grew tall and straight in the mountains north of Israel, producing wood that was strong, fragrant, and highly resistant to decay. For centuries, cedar had been used in royal palaces and monumental buildings across the region. King David had already used cedar in the construction of his own palace in Jerusalem, but for the temple, the demand would be far greater. This is where a key alliance enters the story. According to 1 Kings chapter 5, Solomon reached out to Hiram, the king of Tyre. Tyre was a powerful Phoenician city located along the Mediterranean coast, known for its skilled craftsmen, maritime trade, and access to the forests of Lebanon. Hiram had been a friend of David, and when he heard that Solomon had become king, he sent messengers to greet him. Solomon used this opportunity to explain the task ahead of him. He told Hiram that he intended to build a temple for the name of the Lord his God, fulfilling the promise that had been given to his father David. Solomon also acknowledged something practical. Among his own people, there were no lumberjacks as experienced as the Sidonians, and the workers from the Phoenician region. So Solomon proposed an agreement. The workers of Tyre would cut cedar and cypress trees from the mountains of Lebanon. In exchange, Solomon would provide food supplies for Hiram's household and kingdom. The Bible describes this agreement as a peaceful alliance between the two kings. Once the trees were cut, the next challenge was transportation. The forests of Lebanon were far from Jerusalem. Moving enormous cedar logs across such distances required creativity and organization. According to the biblical account, the Phoenicians developed a clever method. The logs were transported down the mountains to the Mediterranean coast, where they were tied together to form large floating rafts. These rafts were then sent along the coastline by sea until they reached a location closer to Israel. From there, the timber would be unloaded and transported inland toward Jerusalem. But wood was only one part of the temple's materials. The structure itself required enormous stones for its foundation and walls. The book of 1 Kings explains that Solomon commanded the workers to quarry great stones, costly stones, in order to lay the foundation of the temple. These were not small building blocks. Many scholars believe the stones used in ancient Israelite construction could weigh several tons each. Cutting such stones required skilled labor and specialized tools. Large teams of workers would extract the stones from quarries, carefully shaping them into the precise dimensions required for the building. The Bible later reveals an interesting detail about this process. The stones were prepared at the quarry itself, far from the temple site. This meant that when the stones finally arrived in Jerusalem, they were already perfectly shaped and ready to be placed into the structure. Along with wood and stone, the temple also required vast quantities of metal. A gold would eventually cover much of the interior of the temple. Silver and bronze were used for various sacred objects, tools, and decorative elements. Bronze in particular played a major role in the outer courtyard, where large items such as the altar and the famous Sea of Bronze would later be placed. Gathering these materials was not a small task. Gold had to be collected from trade and tribute. Bronze required copper and tin. Skilled metalworkers would later melt and shape these materials into sacred vessels and artistic decorations. All of this reveals something remarkable about the temple project. It was not only a religious undertaking, it was one of the most complex logistical operations Israel had ever attempted. Forests in Lebanon, quarries outside Jerusalem, sea routes along the Mediterranean, and trade connections across the region all became part of a single coordinated effort. Every beam of cedar, every carved stone, and every piece of metal had to be prepared long before the temple itself began to rise. But materials alone could not build the house of the Lord. Behind this massive operation stood something even more impressive. Tens of thousands of workers who would carry, cut, shape, and assemble the pieces of what would become the most important building in Israel's history. And the scale of that workforce is the next part of the story. Once the materials for the temple were secured, another enormous challenge remained. Who would actually build it? The construction of the Temple of Solomon was not the work of a small group of craftsmen. According to the Bible, it was a project that required the labor of an entire nation. Thousands of people would be involved in cutting timber, quarrying stone, transporting materials, and supervising the work. The scale of the workforce described in the book of 1 Kings is remarkable. In 1 Kings 5:13-16, the Bible explains that King Solomon organized a massive labor force drawn from Israel. 30,000 men were sent to Lebanon to work with the Phoenician lumberjacks cutting cedar trees. But these workers did not remain there permanently. Solomon organized them into rotating groups. 10,000 workers would go to Lebanon for 1 month at a time. After that month of labor, they would return home for 2 months, while another group took their place. This system allowed the work to continue constantly, while preventing the workers from being away from their families for long periods. But the workers in Lebanon were only part of the workforce. The biblical account also mentions 70,000 carriers. These men were responsible for transporting heavy materials, especially the massive stones coming from the quarries. Moving stones that weighed several tons required strength, coordination, and carefully organized teams. Alongside them were 80,000 stonecutters working in the hill country. Their job was to extract large blocks of stone from the quarries and shape them according to the specifications required for the temple. These were not rough cuts. The stones had to be carefully measured and shaped so they would fit perfectly once transported to the construction site. This required experience, skill, and careful supervision. And that brings us to another important group mentioned in the Bible, the overseers. The book of 1 Kings tells us that Solomon appointed more than 3,000 supervisors to direct the work. Their responsibility was to organize the laborers, manage the transportation of materials, and ensure that each stage of the project followed the king's instructions. In other words, the temple construction required not only workers, but also a highly organized system of leadership. And this reveals something significant about the project. The temple was not built through random effort or disorganized labor. It was the result of careful planning, structured teams, and a clear chain of command. Every group of workers had a specific role to play in the larger operation. There were lumberjacks in the forests of Lebanon, stonecutters shaping blocks in the quarries, carriers transporting materials across difficult terrain, supervisors coordinating every stage of the work. All of them were part of the same mission, preparing the house that would be dedicated to the Lord. The numbers described in the biblical text suggest that more than 180,000 workers were involved in different parts of the operation. For the ancient world, this represented a truly massive construction effort. But even with thousands of workers, skilled craftsmen, and carefully prepared materials, one unusual detail about the construction still stands out in the biblical account. When the temple itself was finally assembled in Jerusalem, something surprising happened. Despite the enormous scale of the project, the construction site remained completely silent. Among all the details described in the construction of Solomon's temple, one verse stands out as particularly intriguing. It appears in 1 Kings 6:7. The verse says that while the temple was being built, it was constructed with stones finished at the quarry, so that no hammer, chisel, or iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. At first glance, this might seem like a small detail, but when we stop and think about it, the statement is extraordinary. The construction of a massive stone building normally produces constant noise. Stonecutters strike rock with iron tools. Builders shape blocks on site. Workers adjust pieces as they assemble the structure. Yet in Jerusalem, or during the construction of the temple, the Bible tells us that none of these sounds were heard. How was that possible? The answer lies in the level of preparation that took place long before the materials reached the Temple Mount. Instead of shaping the stones at the construction site, the workers prepared them in distant quarries. There, stonecutters carefully measured, carved, and finished each block according to the exact specifications required for the temple. And this meant that when the stones were finally transported to Jerusalem, they already fit perfectly into place. The builders did not need to hammer or reshape them on site. Each piece had been designed in advance to match the structure. This level of precision required remarkable planning. The stonecutters had to know exactly where each block would be placed within the building. The dimensions had to be calculated long before the stones ever reached the city. In many ways, the temple was like a giant puzzle being assembled piece by piece. Every stone had its place. When the materials finally arrived in Jerusalem, the workers simply positioned them according to the design. The structure could rise quietly, without the sound of tools shaping the stone. But there may have been another reason for this silence. The temple was not just another building project. It was considered the most sacred place in the entire nation of Israel. It would become the center of worship, the place where sacrifices would be offered, and where the presence of God was symbolically associated with the Ark of the Covenant. Because of this sacred purpose, the construction itself may have been treated with a sense of reverence. Preparing the materials away from the Temple Mount meant that the site where the house of the Lord would stand remained calm and undisturbed during the building process. Instead of the noise of chisels and hammers echoing through Jerusalem, the structure rose in quiet order, stone after stone, beam after beam. Slowly, the temple began to take shape. Its outer walls stood tall on Mount Moriah. The cedar beams formed the internal structure. Skilled craftsmen began preparing the interior spaces that would later be covered in gold and decorated with intricate carvings. What had once been only a promise given during the time of David was now becoming a visible reality. But the most breathtaking part of the temple was still ahead, because once the structure itself was complete, the inside of the temple would be transformed into one of the most stunning sacred spaces described in the Bible. Once the main structure of the temple was completed, the work was far from over. In fact, some of the most remarkable details of Solomon's temple were found inside its walls. The interior of the temple was designed not only as a place of worship, but also as a space that reflected beauty, symbolism, and deep reverence for the God of Israel. According to the description in 1 Kings chapters 6 and 7, the interior walls of the temple were lined with cedar wood. This wood covered the stone structure, and created a warm, rich interior foundation. But the design did not stop there. The cedar panels were carefully carved with decorative images. The Bible mentions carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers engraved into the wood. These designs likely represented life, creation, and the heavenly realm. Even before the gold was added, the temple already contained extraordinary craftsmanship. Then came the gold. Large portions of the temple's interior were covered in pure gold. The walls, the ceilings, and many of the sacred objects were overlaid with it. When sunlight entered the temple courts and reflected from the gold surfaces, the entire space would have shimmered with light. The effect must have been breathtaking. The temple itself was divided into two main sections. The first was the holy place, the area where priests performed daily acts of worship. Inside this room were several sacred objects that played important roles in Israel's spiritual life. There was the golden lampstand, whose flames provided light inside the sanctuary. There was also the table for the bread of the presence, where special loaves were placed before the Lord as a symbolic offering. Beyond the holy place stood a second chamber separated by doors and curtains. This inner room was known as the Most Holy Place, or the Holy of Holies. It was the most sacred space in the entire temple. The Most Holy Place was designed as a perfect cube, emphasizing completeness and sacred order. Inside this chamber would eventually rest the Ark of the Covenant, the same Ark that had accompanied Israel through the wilderness and throughout its early history. But the Ark would not stand alone. The Bible describes two enormous cherubim placed inside the Most Holy Place. These were not small decorative figures. Each cherub was made from olive wood and covered with gold, standing about 10 cubits high, which is roughly 15 feet. Their wings stretched across the room from wall to wall. One wing of the first cherub touched one side of the chamber, while one wing of the second cherub touched the opposite wall. Their inner wings met in the center, forming a symbolic covering over the space where the ark would be placed. The imagery reflected the idea of divine guardianship and the holiness of the place where God's presence would be symbolically associated. Outside the temple building itself was the courtyard, where some of the largest objects of the temple complex were located. One of these was the bronze altar used for sacrifices. Another was the famous Sea of Bronze, an enormous basin supported by 12 bronze oxen. This basin held water used by the priests for ceremonial washing before performing their duties. Every part of the temple complex had purpose, symbolism, and careful design. After years of preparation, materials, and labor, the house of the Lord was finally complete. But one final moment remained. The temple had been built. Now it needed to be dedicated. After years of preparation, labor, and careful craftsmanship, the Temple of Solomon was finally complete. The stones had been placed, the cedar beams secured, and the interior covered with gold. The sacred chambers stood ready, and the great cherubim waited inside the most holy place. Everything had been prepared exactly as planned, but the temple still awaited its most important moment, the dedication. According to 1 Kings chapter 8, King Solomon gathered the leaders of Israel, the elders of the tribes, and the heads of the families. People from across the nation traveled to Jerusalem to witness the event. It was not just a royal ceremony, it was a national moment of worship. At the center of this moment was the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark had been kept in the city of David, the area of Jerusalem where it had rested since the days of King David. Now it was time for the Ark to be carried into the new temple that had been built for the name of the Lord. The priests and Levites carefully lifted the Ark and began the procession. Alongside the Ark, they also brought the tabernacle and the sacred furnishings that had been used in Israel's earlier worship. These items represented centuries of Israel's spiritual history, stretching back to the days of Moses in the wilderness. As the Ark was carried toward the temple, sacrifices were offered in such large numbers that the Bible says they could not be counted. Finally, but the priests entered the temple and carried the Ark into the most holy place. There, beneath the wings of the great golden cherubim, they placed the Ark in its resting place. The long poles used to carry it remained visible from the holy place, reminding the people of how the Ark had once been transported during Israel's journeys. For the first time in history, the Ark of the Covenant now rested inside a permanent sanctuary. But what happened next is one of the most powerful moments recorded in the Bible. When the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the temple of the Lord. The glory of the Lord filled the house so strongly that the priests were unable to continue their service. This cloud symbolized the presence of God. It was similar to the cloud that had guided Israel through the wilderness and filled the tabernacle in the days of Moses. Now that same divine presence filled the newly built temple in Jerusalem. Seeing this, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the entire assembly of Israel. He lifted his hands toward heaven and prayed. In his prayer, Solomon acknowledged that no building, no matter how magnificent, could truly contain God. Heaven and the highest heavens could not contain him. Yet Solomon asked that God would allow his name to dwell in this temple. He prayed that when people turned toward this place in prayer, seeking forgiveness, help, or mercy, that God would hear them from heaven. The temple was now more than a structure. It had become the spiritual center of Israel. The house built for the name of the Lord had been dedicated, and the presence of God had filled it. The construction of Solomon's temple was more than an architectural achievement. It was the fulfillment of a promise that had begun years earlier in the heart of King David and was completed during the reign of his son, Solomon. From the forests of Lebanon to the quarries where the stones were shaped, thousands of people were involved in preparing the materials that would become the house of the Lord. Massive cedar beams were transported across great distances. Enormous stones were cut with precision. Skilled craftsmen carved wood, shaped bronze, and covered the interior with gold. Every part of the temple reflected careful planning and deep reverence. Yet the temple was never meant to be admired only for its beauty or its engineering. Its true purpose was spiritual. It was the place where the people of Israel came to pray, to offer sacrifices, and to seek the presence of God. It became the center of worship, a reminder of the covenant between the Lord and his people. And when the Ark of the Covenant was placed inside the most holy place and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, it confirmed something powerful. The house built in Jerusalem had been accepted as a place dedicated to the name of the Lord. Even today, the story of Solomon's temple continues to inspire people who read the Bible. It reminds us that behind every great structure described in Scripture is a deeper purpose, a desire to honor God and remain faithful to his promises. Now I'd love to hear from you. Which part of the construction of Solomon's temple impressed you the most? Write your answer in the comments below, and also tell us which city and country you are watching from. And if you enjoy discovering the deeper stories of the Bible, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next journey into the history of Scripture.